Hey there, hey there, hey there. Welcome back to my channel. And thank you so much for taking your time and watching this video. I hope that you all are doing great today. So without further ado, let's begin. So for today's video, guys, I'm going to be doing another reading a book ASMR video. But this time I decided to do it in a soft spoken or soft whispering style because basically for me soft spoken is one of my favorite triggers in ASMR, and a lot of people find it very tingly. So let's begin. Our topic for today is all about the skeletal system. So the first topic is the bone structure. In an earlier chapter, we saw that the bones are composed chiefly of bone tissue known as osseous tissue. It should be understood at the outset that a bone is anything but lifeless, even though the spaces between the cells of bone tissue are permitted with stony deposits of calcium. These cells themselves are very much alive. Bones are organs with their own system of blood and lymphatic vessels and nerves. In the embryo, most of the bones to be are cartilaged, and during the second and third months following conception, calcium compounds begin to be deposited in the skeleton. The process of depositing this hard calcium salts continues throughout life, and more rapidly at some times than at others. In children, the bones are relatively pliable because they contain a larger proportion of cartilage and a smaller amount of a firm calcium salts than those of the adult. In the elderly person, in the elderly person, there is much less of a softer tissues such as cartilage and high proportion of calcium salts. Therefore, the bones are brittle. Fractures of bones in older people heal with difficulty mainly because of this relatively high proportion of inert material and a small amount of the more vascular softer tissues. There are two kinds of marrow. The red marrow, found in certain parts of all the bones, which manufactures most of the blood cells. And the second one is the yellow marrow of the soup bone type, found chiefly in essential cavities of long bones. Yellow marrow is also a largely fat. So I just want to tap something in the table. So I'm just going to find any object here. So just wait a minute. Alright. Bones are covered on the outside by a membrane called periosteum. The central cavity of the long bones is lined with a thinner membrane known as the endosteum. This bone membranes contains blood and lymph vessels as well as nerves, which latter make their presence felt if, for instance, one suffers a blow on the skin. The chief functions of endosteum and periosteum are to produce bone during the period of the individual's growth and to aid in the repair following an injury such as a fracture. Alright, the main function of bones is to serve as a firm framework to the entire body. Number two is to protect such delicate structures as the brain and the spinal cord. And number three is to serve as levers, which are actuated by the muscles that are attached to them. Also is to serve as a storehouse for calcium, which may be removed and become part of the blood if there is not enough calcium in the diet. And the last but not the least, one of the functions of the bones is to produce blood cells. Blood cells in our body. Now let's move on and talk about the divisions of the skeleton. The completely bony framework of the body is known as the skeleton, and it may be divided into main groups. The eggshell skeleton, which forms the bony framework of the head and the trunk, and the appendicular skeleton, which forms the framework for those parts usually referred to as the arms and legs, but called extremities by the biologist. The framework of the head and the bony framework of the head is called the skull, and it is subdivided into two parts, namely the cranium, which is a rounded box that encloses the brain and is made of eight indistinct cranial bones. Bones. The facial portion of the skull composed of 14 separate bones, and the bones that form the cranium are the frontal bone, which forms the framework for the forehead and the roof between the eyeballs, and the frontal parts of the cerebrum, and contains two air spaces or the synosis. The two parietal bones, which form the larger part of the upper and side walls of the cranium. The two temporal bones, which form the lower sides and part of the base of the central areas of the skull, and which contain the mastoid synosis, as well as the parts of the ear. The single ethmoid, which is a delicate, spongy bone located between the eyes and forming a part of the cranial floor between the frontal lobes of the brain and the upper nasal cavities. The sphenoid bone, which is a hat-shaped bone that extends behind the eyes and forms a part of the base of the skull in this region. So here is an illustration of our skeletal system, and here is a illustration of our skull. The single occipital bone, which is located at the back of the skull and includes most of the base of the skull. It extends at the base to meet with the sphenoid medially and temporal and parietal at the sides. The places at which the cranial bones join are called sutures. And the facial bones include the mandible or lower jawbone, which is the only movable bone of the skull. The maxillae, which form the upper jaw, and each maxilla contains a rather large air space called the maxillary sinus. The zygomatic bones, one on each side, which form the higher portion of the cheek. Smaller bones of the face, which include the two larimal bones, one at the corner of each eye, the single vomer that forms the lower part of the nasal septum, and the paired palatine bones at the back of the hard palate, and the slender nasal bones supporting the bridge of the nose, and the paired inferior nasal conchae, and the paired superior and the middle nasal conchae are all part of the ethmoid, one of the cranial bones. In addition to the bones of the cranium and the facial bones, there are six tiny bones of ossicles in the middle ear and a single horseshoe or U-shaped bone that lies just below the skull power called hyoid bone, to which the tongue is attached. Actually, the hyoid bone may be thought of as forming the boundary between some of the head structures and those of the neck. It is suspended by a ligament of each side from the temporal bones and can be felt near the mandible or lower jaw bone in the upper neck region. Openings in the base of the skull provide spaces for the entrance and exit of many blood vessels, nerves, and other structures, and projections and slightly elevated portions of the bones provide for the attachment of the muscle and sometimes contain delicate structures, as, for example, the part that encloses the middle and internal parts of the ear. Air spaces called sinuses provide lightness and serve as resonating chambers for the voice. The framework of the trunk. The bones of the trunk. Alright, alright. I think that is